I'm standing in front of a plot looking at weed competition in cotton. This is a study that we're repeating in 2008. It's something in 2007 that we really used to talk about how detrimental the effects of weed competition are on cotton yield. And I think the results of this year's study are going to be very similar to what we saw in 2007. I'm standing in front of a plot that's had absolutely no weed competition all season. And in order to ensure that we had no weed competition, this plot was sprayed 5 times with Roundup over the top, and it received residual applications in 3 of those weed control applications to ensure that we did not have any additional weed flushes throughout the year. So the cotton came up in a clean seed bed. There were no weeds that were allowed to compete at any time during the season, and this cotton should have maximum yield. As we go down the field, each one of those treatments was sprayed at 7-day intervals. And the crop was planted. It took about 7 days to emerge, and once the crop had emerged to a stand, we counted down each week. For example, the next plot was sprayed 7 days with Roundup after the crop emergence. So the weeds that emerged between planting and that 7-day application were allowed to compete with the crop. The next plot down, the weeds were allowed to compete for 14 days, 21 days, 28 days, and 35 days after crop emergence. Now, all of this was burned down very clean prior to emergence. However, this is a very heavily infested plot area with Palmer pigweed. So last year, what we saw is that waiting up to 2 weeks to control those weeds after emergence with severe weed pressure, we lost 13% yield. As we waited out 1 month, or essentially to the 4th true leaf under severe weed competition, we lost nearly 50% of our total yield potential due to weed competition. Now, a couple of things that we've seen this year that are pretty interesting. The first thing is that we saw a reduction in height. Each week we waited, the crop was shorter at the end of the season. The other thing that's beginning to become apparent now is crop maturity and the delay in crop maturity due to weed competition. For example, you see the number of open bolls in the plot that had no weed competition all year. You see a similar level of open bolls in the plot that had only 7 days of weed competition. But as you look at 14, 21, 28, and 35 days after emergence or a delayed Roundup application, you see a tremendous number of green bolls and a tremendous delay in maturity, which is ultimately going to cost us yield. So what's the bottom line for weed competition and weed control in cotton? The bottom line is to use an approach where you start clean at planting and you stay clean for the rest of the season. Now, there are lots of different ways to do that. We currently recommend a burn down application prior to planting, an application of a residual material at planting like Cotoran, followed by an application of Roundup plus our metolachlor product called Parlay, and then controlling weeds as needed through the season. By doing that, you do 2 things. One is you reduce competition from early season weeds that ultimately contribute to lost yield. The second thing you do with that type of system is introduce multiple modes of action that will delay weed resistance from occurring in your area. And so the first thing to remember is that weed competition creates yield loss. The second thing to remember is that delaying weed control applications beyond that optimum timing window that is causing your yield loss, you're also controlling weeds that have gotten much larger and are much more difficult to control, and ultimately we could lead to resistance problems. So again, start clean, stay clean throughout the season with additional applications of Roundup plus a residual material, and time those applications early when the weeds are small and the risk of crop competition is less.